Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Dr. Swope from Germantown, Maryland. And as we approach and kind of draw close to this week, today we're going to be talking, or draw close to this whole kind of series, actually. Today we're going to be talking about personality. We've got a lot of bullet points here, but to sum it up, really what we want to do today is if we're going to study personality, well, then we got to understand how we're going to study personality. So they're just like with intelligence, there's different ways to measure it. With really anything, the question comes back to research, research, research. Which research method are we going to use to study personality? And then the next couple of things we want to do is, because psychology is so broad, remember we have multiple approaches. We want to look at how different approaches are going to view personality, how it's formed and how we measure it. We're going to kind of compare and contrast those approaches and the people who kind of brought those approaches to the forefront. Some very important psychologists that you've probably seen. So we're going to match the names with the theory. And then we're going to look at the idea of kind of modern personality theories and how we can scientifically what's called arrange traits into kind of a coherent way of measuring and assessing personality. Okay, having gotten all that stuff done and out of the way, let's move forward. Let's talk about where you left off last night, or maybe it was this morning. You kind of knocked out this FRQ from yesterday. Let's talk about Jordan and his date. Jordan had a date that went well. I don't think he's a member of the Schmidlat family, but we can only assume because Mrs. Fenton wrote this FRQ. Jordan had a date that went well. The couple went to an amusement park and went on several roller coasters, ate cotton candy and funnel cakes, and won an extra large stuffed animal in a carnival game. Oh. After arriving home, Jordan texts his date to say, "I miss you already. How can the following psychological concepts be explained in the context of Jordan's situation?" Okay, so we've got four kind of theories, four important things. Let's dig through them. Let's apply them. Let's define them and apply them. Here we go. The James Longa theory. James Longa theory of emotion is based on the idea that physiological responses precede and automatically create the experience of each emotion. Okay, so important words there. Remember, it's the physiological that causes the emotion. So after the date, Jordan's heart is racing and his mind automatically interprets that as the emotion of joy. And it's important that you distinguish that the physiological comes before. Heart racing causes the emotion. Okay. Drive reduction theory. The theory that individuals are motivated to act in order to reduce the physiological tension or drive created when a biological need is not met in order to return the body to homeostasis. The important word there is homeostasis. Jordan has not eaten, and because the biological need for food is not met, he is hungry and eats a whole bunch of stuff at the fair or carnival to fulfill his need and thus returning homeostasis. Okay. Joseph Ledoux's dual theory. The dual pathway theory states that messages about fear travel through the brain simultaneously on two tracts or roads, one fast and one slow. The slow road involves analysis by the cortex, while the fast road travels directly to the limbic system. I think that makes sense. The slow road, you need to interpret, you need to think it through. When Jordan is on the roller coaster and sees the big drop, that message travels on the fast road directly to his amygdala, resulting in fear. At the same time, the message also travels on the slow road or slow high road, because remember, you're going to think this through. The cortex is going to think it through, which can decide that it's not that scary and it's a little bit fun too. Okay. Approach avoidance conflict. Approach avoidance is a decision-making problem in which an individual is faced with a single goal that has both positive and negative aspects to it. You can imagine, opening up the AP exam when you get that. You want to do it, but you're nervous for it. So that's approach avoidance, right? So while at the amusement park, Jordan must decide whether to play a carnival game. While winning would improve his date, losing would be embarrassing, or Jordan must decide whether to eat the funnel cake when at the park. While it tastes delicious, it has no nutritional value. Okay. So hopefully your work with these answers, these definitions and applications match what you've got. Let's go quickly through as we're getting closer and closer to the AP exam coming up on May 19th. And remember, this was going to be our last week. Next week, of course, is our actual last week. Let's make sure you have all of the tools and resources you need. Really quickly, to access some extra help, I want you to log in at myap.collegeboard.org. Once you're there, and I know Mrs. Fenton went through this, but we can't be sure everyone saw this, and it's good to have this for those who weren't live and they can kind of watch the recorded version. Once you access this, you're going to click on AP Classroom right here. Once you do that, right here, practice answering free response questions. You're going to click there to get optional student practice. Once you're there, look, if you haven't started it, it's going to say begin. Now, if you have started but had to run away and do whatever you have to do and you want to come back, you'll be able to pick up where you left off and continue. And it's up to you to choose which unit, maybe which content that you think you need to focus on. Okay. Once you do that, you're going to type your response here. What is nice about that is once you do that, you're going to then say, yes, you want to submit. You need to submit the assessment in order for you to see how this question is scored. So you're going to say, yes, review again. Yes, you submit. Yes, review. And then you're going to see some examples of what a response should include to earn the maximum number of points. Okay. So I just want to let you know we have that aware. And of course, with Mrs. Fenton's and my this series, we've had a whole bunch of FRQs. Please feel free if you missed a couple of days to scroll back through, watch them, see what we set up, and then see how we answer it the next day. So you got a lot of tools out there to help you out. Reminders. Remember that even though we originally scheduled to stop tomorrow, we're going to go next week. It's called Prep Week. We're going to time practice exams. We're going to have exam tips, and we're going to have special guests. Speaking of the special guests, super quickly, we're going to have what's called chief readers. If you are an AP psychology teacher or if you're an AP psychology reader, you know what a chief reader is. But if you're a high school student, you might not. Chief reader is the college professor who's in charge of the grading of the psychology exam. And in years past, and especially this year, it is a tremendous responsibility. Hundreds of thousands of students traditionally take the AP psychology exam. And if there's 2 FRQs, you can imagine that all of those pieces of paper, they need to be shipped. You need to get enough people. It's just an amazing logistical thing. And they needed to be graded, and they needed to be graded reliably and valid. So the chief reader is the person that makes that happen. And we're going to have several chief readers come and give us some hints, some introductions and words of encouragement next week. So I hope you can tune in there. And then we're going to have Dr. Amy Feinberg. She is AP psychology, right? She works for the College Board. She directs curriculum, instruction, assessment. So basically, if it has to do with AP psychology, it goes through Dr. Feinberg, and she's going to join us next week to let us know what she thinks we can do to improve ourselves, and just kind of wish us luck, encouragement, and maybe take the edge off the nerves. Okay. Also, special guests, we have confirmed Dr. Loftus. You probably recognize her name from the idea of how memory works, and more importantly, how memory doesn't work. And then and eyewitness testimony and those kind of things. And then you have Dr. Steele, who you might know from, and I know I talked about it, from Stereotype Threat. Of course, these renowned and established and distinguished researchers are known for just a vocabulary word, but it is something to be, we know them from those kind of things. So they'll be joining us. If you have questions for them, you can submit it to the email asknancyandjoe@gmail.com. Okay, let's jump into today's stuff. Today, we're going to do personality, all about personality. And as I mentioned before, the question is, how are we going to study this? Okay. And it's basically which research method. Can we do an experiment on personality? It's kind of tough to do, right? So each method has its advantages and disadvantages. The goal in any research is to gather information. And so the question again is, how do we do it? And I use the example that a saw is a great tool, but it's not good for pounding in nails. A hammer is a wonderful tool, but it's not good for screwing in a screw. So each research method has its pros and cons. I like to use the word enduring. See, personality is enduring. It's not temporary like moods, but also remember it's not permanent. If the brain can change, and we know it can change because of plasticity, then we know that personality can change throughout someone's lifestyle. I think you're familiar with the word case study. The advantage of doing a case study on someone, you get a detailed information about their personality. You can look at their personal history, their medical history, family interactions, job interactions, friend interactions. The problem with that is it's resource intensive. Think of the time it takes to crawl through, if not every detail, most of the details of a person's life. And sometimes it occurs after an incident. Unfortunately, maybe there's a tragedy and someone wants to know, well, why did that happen? What is going on? What makes someone do this? And so that you dig into a case study or an unusual case. You probably, if you were to go to a therapist because you have a specific phobia, I don't know they would do a detailed case study on you, but they would use some other methods to kind of get some information about you. So case study, again, great for getting detailed, but it's usually narrowed down to one person or a cohort of people. Survey, kind of the opposite. A fancy name for a survey, of course, is a self-report measure. And the reason I say it's kind of obvious is it's easy to give and score. So it's not resource intensive. It's kind of, I don't want to say free, but you can get a lot of information very quickly. The problem is it's what I call surface depth. You're getting a lot of information about a lot of people, but you're not going necessarily too deep into them. And you've got several cons, or we can say confounding variables with surveys. Number one, sometimes people just lie, especially if it's a sensitive survey on whether they've broken a law or did different illegal substances or something like that. And then there could be misunderstanding the question. And then again, I mentioned that sometimes surveys, the question don't allow for people to really explain. With that, it's important to note the self-report bias. Remember, most people are going to report themselves as above average. We all are convinced that we can sing really, really well when we're alone or when we're in the car, when we think we nailed that note, but you know what, maybe we aren't accurate repliers or not accurate understanders, if that's a word, of our own talents and our own shortcomings. Okay. Another research method to investigate personality is called a personality inventory. So I want you to think it's kind of like a survey, but it's a longer and more specialized survey. It's very involved and it's constructed carefully. This isn't something you're going to find somewhere on the internet and it says, "Oh, well, you belong in Slytherin house," or whatever kind of personality type you're going to have. Personality inventories. I think the most famous one, it's going to be the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And when I say it's longer and specialized, the MMPI has hundreds of questions. It's going to take a while to get through. And the questions in the MMPI are going to be true and false. It might say true or false. I oftentimes wake up troubled. True or false. I oftentimes have a fulfilling or happy day. And what they're going to do is those hundreds of questions, they're going to be able to identify traits that might correspond with each other. And once you get a cluster of traits together, those cluster of traits might correspond with disorder. So the MMPI is a pretty good diagnostic tool to look at some personality types that might correlate with certain disorders or being troubled. And we use the method of what's called factor analysis. We've talked about that in previous episodes, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later today. But factor analysis is a method for looking at relationships between variables, maybe between question 3 and question 23, and those kind of things on a long inventory. Okay, the advantage of a personality inventory is it's objective. It can be scored by a machine. I think everyone here has thought about the concept of, if not the brand name of Scantron, or taking a multiple choice question online, it's true, false, or A, B, C, D, or something like that. It's either right or wrong, and that's objective. That's great, and it leads to validity because it can be scored by a machine or routine. Now, the question is the opposite of objective is subjective, or we're going to dovetail and segue into projective tests. Unlike bubbling in a circle on a piece of paper or taking a multiple choice test on a computer, a projective test, a person is shown an ambiguous stimuli, whether a picture or a scene. And then a trained professional interprets it. Now notice you can probably already see the confounding variable. Another human being is going to interpret this. And if you have ever written what you think is a fantastic English essay or poem and the teacher didn't like it, was that because your writing was bad or because that human being didn't like that thing? So you can see there's going to be a tiny bit of wiggle room when we look at the validity. The beauty or the goal of projective tests is that often people don't have insight into themselves. Many of us are blind to our own flaws and what's troubling us. I'm sure everyone who's listening to this and the one person who's speaking into this has been mad but didn't know why. Or maybe you're anxious about something but you didn't know why. So perhaps looking at using some of these projective tests can help us dig into the unconscious. One of the pros is it removes the Hawthorne effect, because if you don't know what the person is looking for, you can't what's called game the system. You can't really write your response or give your analysis of this ambiguous picture in a way to make yourself look good. And again, the con, as I hinted at, is it's going to rely on other people to interpret these results. Okay. Everyone's going to have a bad day. So what if your psychologist, what if your diagnostician who's looking at your results is having a bad day? Is that going to color their ability to analyze or perhaps figure out what's going on with you? The one of the more well-known of this is the thematic apperception test. Look at the root word here, apperception. Remember, when you put an A in front of a word, oftentimes it negates that. Okay. You can think of the word sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction. Well, apperception means you can't really perceive what's going on. So if you show a neutral scene, then the client will write or narrate a caption or explanation of what's going on in that scene. And what they write can be interpreted. Maybe there's a theme, maybe there's an underlying message or several layers, and a trained psychologist can find out what's really going on. The other example of this is the Rorschach ink blot test. And it's a set of cards. With when you do a thematic apperception test or Rorschach, it's not just one and done. You don't just show someone an ink blot and you say, well, if someone responds, that's a butterfly. From one response, you're not going to be able to dig in and tease out what is the unconscious personality. It's a set of cards, and you're looking for a theme, and you might have to do this over and over and over again to get, again, this kind of pattern of responses. Okay. So those are your projective tests, and they help kind of figure out what's going on below the surface, even when the client doesn't know themselves. Okay. As I said before, each of those methods, the objective tests, which would be the personality inventories, the surveys, or the projective tests, the MMPI and the Rorschach ink blot, they have their advantages and disadvantages. And the goal is to gather information. But as with all results, and even with, we talked about this with intelligence tests, we need to question whether those methods and the results are reliable and valid. And I think you'll remember, reliability has this question built into it. Are the results stable over multiple attempts? If you were to take the personality test over and over and over again, are you going to get the same result? If not, either you're answering differently, and one day you're Slytherin and one day you're Hufflepuff, or maybe the test itself has a problem. Okay. And I think you can say, does mood matter? What about stages in life? Do you think your parents had the same personality they do, when they were your age? Validity, the big question embedded here is, does the test measure what it says it measures? Does a personality test measure personality? And instantly, all of your hands should rise up and say, define personality. More importantly, operationally define personality. Okay, so part of that is, what is the goal of the test? Is it employment? Is it to help someone who's struggling with something? Could it be, an online dating app where you're trying to match personality types? So the question of validity embedded in that is, what does it say it measures, and for what purpose? And remember, I said each method, each way to study personality is a different tool for a different application. Okay, we're going to look at the different approaches. We've got psychoanalytic, we've got behavioral, socio-cognitive, and humanistic. So let's start with the psychoanalytic. And for our purposes, while there are differences between psychodynamic and psychoanalytic, for our purposes, and perhaps even coming up on the AP psychology exam, if you know the concept, we can use these interchangeably. The most important thing with this is unconscious processes. Unconscious processes. Sigmund Freud, he is a polarizing character. Some people hate him, some people love him, some people dismiss him as really good literature, but not very good science. Because remember, he didn't do any experiments. He didn't collect much data. He collected case histories, but there's questions as to his accuracy and validity. But what Freud's big idea was that unconscious processes and even conflict well below our surface awareness makes us who we are. So let's look at the conflict. We have this idea of animal urges, and we are animals. We have a hypothalamus. We have the 5 Fs, as Mrs. Fenton said. We had, fighting, fleeing, Fahrenheit, fleeing, and what's the other one? Flirting. And the idea there is we have these urges. But the urges, society says, no, no. Society says good little boys and girls don't punch and kick. To be a brave and honorable person, you don't run away. Society has rules about when you can eat. So we're going to have this conflict between, our limbic system, hypothalamus and our frontal lobe, or as a representation. Here's a way to think about it. Your id is almost like a representation of your hypothalamus. Think of the id as a little baby. It does not care about anything. It wants food right now and it'll scream its head off. It's very, very selfish. The superego is what society is. Another way to look at the conflict is what the residue of the trauma of early childhood. Dr. Freud had a pretty unflattering idea of human beings, their unconscious, and the early childhood. He said, perhaps weaning, which is the process of stopping breastfeeding and starting to take solid food. And for a child, that is a horror, according to Dr. Freud. It's a horribly traumatic idea because the one thing that keeps the baby alive, the one thing that is there before he goes to sleep, when he wakes up, the one thing that comforts him, soothes him, and cuddling, now all of a sudden he can't have it. That is an awful situation. Of course, none of us remember that consciously, but unconsciously, how our parents treated us in our early lives leaves kind of a footprint that we're going to grow from. And the trauma of potty training and figuring out who we are, boys or girls, according to Dr. Freud, this shapes our personality in our first 5 years. As far as personality, we have 3 parts. Like I mentioned, the id, think of a baby. It is extraordinarily selfish. It operates on the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, when it wants it, how it wants it, and it will not tolerate any kind of compromise. As we grow, we develop an ego, which is the ability to satisfy the id. As a child begins to crawl and walk, it can put things in its mouth. Eventually, it can feed itself. It can say the word no, and it can act to, the ego can serve the id. But eventually, the ego has to do a balancing act between the superego too. The superego is like the conscience. It's a blend of society, religion, parents, Barney, the Wiggles, what's up, fruit salad, all of the people that taught us right and wrong. You know what? It's really difficult to break with what society says is right or wrong, especially religion. On the other hand, we've got the id saying, go ahead and let's do it. And this, according to Dr. Freud, makes us all messed up and leads to our personality. Okay, well, Freud, we're going to move on from him because he's such a large figure in psychology. He and his ideas spawned or gave rise to a whole bunch of other theoreticians. We call them neo-Freudians, and the belief with neo-Freudians is they have unconscious processes. And what the interesting thing, let's take a look at Dr. Adler. Alfred Adler, you might have heard of the inferiority complex. Now, instead of Dr. Freud's unconscious sexual urges, and that's what Freud's idea was all about, we have an unconscious urge to prove ourselves, an unconscious urge to overcome what we couldn't do as a child, or maybe prove ourselves superior to our failings when we were little or something like this. And this might explain why some of us are driven to work not just to get good grades, but to get great grades, even when we have straight A's, to keep working. And you can imagine there are people who are very financially wealthy and they're very successful, but they want more. And if you ask them, they won't know why, because it's unconscious. Okay, so that's an idea of personality development. From the psychoanalytic point of view, neo-Freudian means unconscious. Carl Jung, Freud's partner slash student slash estranged partner friend. It's an interesting history between the two of them. Carl Jung is known for his collective unconscious, and this is the idea that we share a common unconscious. And you're like, what the heck? How can we have a shared common unconscious? Well, let me give you one evidence for. Perhaps you've had a dream, a very similar to dream as someone that you've never met. How can that be? Well, according to Carl Jung, maybe we all, being part of the same species, have certain ideas or frameworks or themes, or what he called archetypes, that manifest and kind of structure how we think and how we dream. There's not a whole bunch of modern psychological evidence to back this up. But still, we talk about it because it's a powerful idea. And if you've ever been sitting at a stoplight and all of a sudden you turn and you notice someone staring at you, how'd you notice that? That's just a fun way to think about Carl Jung's collective unconscious. Okay. Um, then we also talked about Hermann Rorschach. So here's a picture of Jung. I didn't put in a picture of Herman Rorschach, but for fun, after this, why don't you go ahead and Google him? But Google Rorschach and Brad Pitt, and you'll find a very creepy resemblance. I know. I wonder if people are reincarnated. Okay. So now we're moving on. We're done with a psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. Let's jump into the behavioralist idea of personality. B.F. Skinner wasn't known for his work with personality. Why? Because personality is not directly empirical. You can't measure it in a Skinner box. But let's dig into it for a couple minutes anyway. We're going to apply operant conditioning to personality, because what if we said personality is the result of countless interactions between behaviors? So every single second of the day, we're getting reinforced. If you don't blink, you're going to get punished. Once you blink, well, you're going to have negative reinforcement because the unpleasantness of dry eyes is now removed. So every single second of the day, we're getting punished or reinforced. And so let's get a hypothetical situation. If you're a little kid or if you're a high schooler and you are rewarded with friendships or even a cookie for approaching a group and stepping outside of your comfort zone. If you do that enough and you get a reward for stepping outside of your comfort zone, will that eventually train you to be an extrovert? It's an interesting take. The reason I bring this up is I want you to be able to argue and support the different approaches to psychology, whatever the FRQ might be on May 19th. Okay. Albert Bandura has sometimes, well, he's been involved in a lot of different approaches, sometimes been called a behavioralist, sometimes called a social cognitive psychologist. And of course, he's known for his Bobo doll, but he's known for much more. And we're going to apply the social cognitive idea to the idea of learning, to the idea of personality. So remember the Bobo doll. A model demonstrates violent behavior. A child must have the ability and motivation to imitate. So the model does, the child imitates. Is that how personalities form? Do babies and children and teenagers watch how mom and dad and teacher and role model interact? That's part of it. Okay, remember, we're not simply trained like a Skinnerian behavioralist, like a rat in a cage. We have a brain. We have something between our ears. So we are actively evaluating, reacting, and even changing our environment. Now, once we change our environment, that environment will then influence us. So we've seen this idea of what's called reciprocal determinism, right? Reciprocal determinism is a child's behavior in a class might change the classroom environment. Then the environment, because the environment's changed, the child then might negatively interpret the new environment. Then we got behavior, and the new environment might negatively affect the child's beliefs. So you can see that we are active participants in our personality and our environment. Personality might be a little bit dependent on environment. Okay, I wanted to put a picture up there of Dr. Bandura, and this is, of course, President Obama awarding him. And this is important to me because if we're studying psychology, I want you to know that psychology is important to the fabric of our society. So much of what we know right and wrong and how to help people how to be better is because of psychologists, and it's important to realize that psychology as a science is recognized at the highest level. Okay, well, that's my little plug to make you all major in psychology. Okay, so we've done psychoanalytic, we've done behavioral, we've done sociocognitive. Let's jump into the humanism idea, the humanistic theory of personality. Humanistic is the rejection of what's called fatalistic ideas. Remember, Dr. Freud said, well, our unconscious makes us who we are. We really don't have a choice. And if you believe Skinner, well, our environment makes us who we are, and we didn't pick our environment. We really have no choice. The humanistic psychology is perhaps a bit softer, maybe a little bit more positive. It rejects the idea that we have no control over who we are. One of the main proponents of this is Abraham Maslow. And he suggested we're going to reach back into the motivation idea from the last couple of days. We are motivated to grow, to change, and to seek who we should become under the right circumstances. Many of us are blocked from becoming the best version of ourselves, from fully developing our personality because of things in our way. The highest level of personality development, according to Abraham Maslow, would be self-actualization. And perhaps you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you are, if you are worried about breathing and food and water, well, then you know what, you're not going to be able to develop your personality fully. And so personality development is a process based on interaction. It's a positive step towards becoming the best you can be. So Maslow had a very genuine and good view of human beings. Now, Carl Rogers, who was also a humanist and believed in the humanistic theory of personality, he looked at the idea that humans are good, and same with Maslow. Humans are good creatures. Humans want to do well. And whenever someone is acting badly, whenever their personality seems to conflict with society and conflict with others, there's a problem there. It's not the person themselves. We need to remove the problem. Rogers had this idea of incongruence. And that's when there's a difference between what people see themselves as and what they want to be or think they should be. And very few of us, look in the mirror and say, aha, I'm perfect. Very few of us look at our bank account or report card or SAT report and say, I've nailed it. I can't improve. And that's going to cause a problem. See, we have what's called an ideal self, and that's how a person wishes they were. And unfortunately, you and I both know society puts such a ridiculously high standard, it's almost impossible to get there. And then we have the idea of a perceived self. How do we see themselves? And personality is kind of an intricate dynamic concept between these. And the way to help someone develop a personality, and we're drawing a little bit from the therapy unit here, is to use what's called unconditional positive regard. This means support and positivity even when there's disagreement. So this is an interesting idea. Notice that you almost only get a compliment when you do something that pleases other people the way they want it done. Rarely do we all get a compliment for doing something we like that other people don't like or understand. It's an interesting idea. We look at B.F. Skinner's idea that you get a reward for the right behavior, but what if the behavior forces you into something that's not right for you? And so that might cause people to have conflict within their personality. And so can we remove the discrepancy or dissonance between the perceived self and the ideal self? Okay, so now we looked at some of the different approaches, and interwoven into the different approaches, we had the different theorists, kind of the important people to know in personality. So we're going to kind of shift a little bit, and we're going to look at culture. Okay, how can culture facilitate or constrain personality development? Well, let me ask you this. What is the self? Okay. Or a general question is, who are you? It's a ridiculously hard question. And I don't presume to have any answers. I'm not even sure I know who I am. And I don't know if you know who you are, but let's look at two concepts. Self-esteem is maybe a general feeling of worth. And the question is, how does that come about? And you can see there's a whole bunch of questions that come with that. Self-efficacy, and these two words people get a little mixed up. Self-efficacy is your idea of your ability on a task. Can you do it? And sometimes we're way overconfident. We definitely think we can do something. All right, and sometimes we're like, no way, I'm never going to be able to do it. Self-efficacy is important because maybe it leads to this idea of what's called openness, your willingness to try new things, but you might not try something. We're going to come back to that thing, openness. You won't be able to try something new if you don't think you're going to be good at it. And guess who is going to be known for bringing up self-efficacy? Our friend Dr. Albert Bandura. Remember, most of these psychologists that we study aren't known. They're known for one or two things, but their careers span a whole bunch of things. Okay, so again, who are you? Okay, that's our question for personality. And the answer might depend on the culture in which you were raised. If I were to ask someone who was raised in a collectivist culture, their response would be structured differently than someone who was raised in what's called an individualistic culture. So, a collectivistic culture, identity and self-esteem are tied to one's position in a group or family. Okay. Well-being might be connected to your position in a group and how much you contribute to the group's success. And if you've been on a team sport and you won the championship, it feels good when everyone comes together. So even folks in an individualist society like the United States has experience with coming together and achieving something that you couldn't do by yourself. So collectivistic cultures, your view of who you are is part of a larger whole. Now, individualistic cultures, your identity and self-esteem are tied to how the individual does, what they accomplish in comparison to others, not in relation to others, which a collectivist society might do. Here you're going to have an internal locus of control, meaning that your grade depends on what you can do, how hard you work. It doesn't necessarily depend on your family supporting you. And if you get a good grade in a collectivist culture, it's because your family allowed you to have it. Just a different way of view. Okay. And interestingly, individual cultures are oftentimes correlated with less happiness. Okay. Now we're going to look at trait theories of personality. Okay. And we look at traits. If you don't really know what a trait is, well, let's think of it as an adjective. How many adjectives could there be that define or describe a person? And if so, if you get a list of them, and a psychologist named Gordon Alpert identified about 18,000 of them. Okay, so you got 18,000 adjectives. Can you start to group them together and say, well, this goes with this goes with this, and you start to sort them? And you can see our old friend here, factor analysis. It's a mathematical way to maybe find relationships between variables or between traits, which traits go together. Once we start to get a cluster of traits and we start to get structured, then we can start to build out a theory and a personality test, okay? Again, we'd have to look at the word operationalization. If we were to say, well, that person has a kind personality, what does that mean? How do we define it? How do we reduce it? But look, if we reduce it, so operationalization leads to empiricism. And empiricism is a word that means it can be measured and it can be observed. So for instance, Sigmund Freud's work on the unconscious is not empirical. You can't see the unconscious. You can't necessarily measure it. But Dr. Skinner's work is empirical. You can see the behavior of the dog wagging his tail, or Pavlov's of the dog drooling. So operationalization leads to empiricism. But if you take it too far, it leads to reductionism. Okay, so a personality might not be able to be reduced to 5 traits, 10 traits, 16 traits, just as maybe intelligence can't be reduced to a 2 or 3 digit number. Maybe it can. And this is the idea that we don't want to be too precise, too narrow, that we lose focus of what we're trying to study. And again, that's what we talk about. It risks validity. The more precisely we define something, then perhaps we're not actually defining it. And if you grab a handful of sand, how many grains of sand go in that handful? And if you have probably several hundred or several thousand, but you can't really count it because there are too many. So if you squeeze your hand and you reduce it so you can count it, eventually, if you squeeze it enough, you don't have a handful of sand anymore. Sure, you can count precisely, but of course, then you've lost the idea of a handful of sand. I hope that makes sense. Reductionism is like taking one frame from a video and saying that's what represents the video. So we don't want to be, if we're too precise, we lose the whole picture of what is a personality, which is a dynamic concept. Okay, well, if we're looking at traits, let's look at Hans Eysenck. Okay, and he had kind of two spectrums, what's called bipolar ideas. You had introversion and extroversion. Let's look if we had introversion over here. Let's do extroversion over introversion. You're going to be passive, thoughtful, peaceful. Okay. And if we look at this, introversion, sure, quiet. So these traits go together. These traits, active, doesn't necessarily go together with passive. Sociable doesn't necessarily go together with quiet. So you can see we're going to try to build out a framework of something that's measurable, and traits go together in a factor analysis type of way. Okay, stable is then going to be bipolar or opposite of unstable. Okay, stable, calm, and then unstable is moody. So the idea is if you were to have enough questions, you could pinpoint someone's personality somewhere in one of these quadrants. Okay. So that's one way to look at trait theory and how they go together. And I thought that was an interesting way. Hopefully that made sense. Let's go into something you're probably familiar with called the 5-factor or the Big 5 model of traits. And if you were to make a mnemonic of this, you're going to take the O, the C, the E, the A, and a lot of people call this the ocean model. Okay, so the ocean 5-factor OCEAN. I've also heard people kind of mix it up and call it the canoe model, CANOE. So, ocean or canoe, whatever floats your boat, that is probably going to be, you want to memorize it maybe that way. Okay, it's not whether you are open or not. It's not whether you are conscientious or not. The question is, how much are you? So it's going to be a spectrum. If you score relatively low on the openness spectrum, well, you're going to prefer routine. Okay. And don't, I don't want to oversimplify it and say, well, if you have a 9% here, that means it's a little bit more dynamic than that. Okay. Now, we're all a little bit curious at some times. The question is a general pattern that nobody is never curious, and nobody always prefers routine. So we all fall, of course, on that spectrum. Conscientiousness. Think of the idea of how much you double check your homework, how much you'll triple check and do an extra good job. If you score relatively low on this, perhaps you're a little bit more careless. And you're like, rules, schmools. Rules are made to be broken. And that's not necessarily good or bad. If we all followed rules, we would never have anything new, right? If you score high on the conscientiousness spectrum, you're going to be hardworking, dependable, and you plan ahead, finish tasks, double check. Okay, and you might have heard of Type A personality there. Extroversion, how outgoing you are. And be quiet and withdrawn. This does not mean bad. Extrovert is a really good trait to have, because sometimes people who score high in extroversion, not only do you need social interaction, perhaps you struggle without it. And so some people I'm not saying these are good and these are bad. I'm going back to the point that being an introvert is a very good, powerful, and strong thing. Don't let anyone tell you if you're an introvert that you need to change or try to be more open. Okay, critical of others, that's going to be if you score low on agreeableness. We're all critical of something. And then trusting and empathetic, you're going to score high on agreeableness. Neuroticism, if you score low on this, you're even tempered. You don't oftentimes feel sad or worried or anxious. But if you score high on it, you're prone to worry. And again, we all worry about something. This is not necessarily good or bad. This is more of a neutral assessment. Okay, so now that I think that covers all of the content of what we needed to do now. Okay, let's go into our Schmidlap family, and then we have a few more slides to dig into, and maybe we can get into some questions that some students have submitted to Ask Nancy and Joe at gmail.com. Okay, James Schmidlap, the father of the Schmidlap clan, is watching his children grow. He marvels at how they all seem so different, despite the fact that they were being raised by his wife and him. He believes his wife and he raised them each consistently and fairly, yet he still marvels at the differences between the 5 children. Using the following terms, please explain how the following terms might result in differences or perceived differences in the children's personality. So we're looking at differences, or importantly, notice the word perceived differences. Okay, so that's going to be your 4 terms there. Make sure that when you define conscientiousness is, and directly relate it to, Mr. Schmidlap or James Schmidlap either sees or perceives, those kind of things. So really tie it back to the question. Okay, so don't forget to, as we kind of wind down, remember tomorrow's our last day of content, but next week's prep week. So as we get closer and we're winding down, don't forget to email your questions to asknancyandjoe@gmail.com. Email questions about content. Okay, about test tips, and we'll maybe get to a few student emails today. Questions for Dr. Loftus, who is going to join us. Remember, she is most known for eyewitness testimony and implanting false memories. So if you want to ask her a question, email it to us. Remember, though, she is known for far more than that. And for Dr. Steele, and he is known for stereotype threat, and for that, and for far more. Questions for the chief reader: what goes on behind the scenes in creating an AP exam and how they're graded. Also, send a picture of your pets. These are my 2. The golden is Rudy. The black lab is Max. You heard Max one time a couple weeks ago. It was thunderstorming in Maryland during our live broadcast. He hates thunder, so he snuck in here and then decided to bark loudly to let us all know that he hates thunder. Okay, remember to time yourself doing the FRQ, and then practice emailing it to yourself. Over the weekend, find some FRQs, do them, time them, and when you're done, email it to yourself. Okay, just to simulate that idea. But we're going to again practice that in prep week next week. Keep studying content and vocab. This is critical. The more you know before, the better you're going to be during. Please, please, please do not kind of rest and say, it's an open note test. I'll be fine. Trust me on this. You want to go in with a strong foundation of content. Student questions. We've heard from Jonah at Port Huron Northern High School, Kareem in the International School in Abu Dhabi, and Sabrina in Westview High School. So let's look at what Kareem says. His general gist of his question is, would a person lose their chance, I got my printed out questions here, of getting a 5 if they miss a few points? And here's my response to that. I don't know. okay, because I haven't set up the rubric yet. But here's what I want to pull back and say, don't think it that way. Okay, you can't control what the rubric will be. All you can control is how much time you put in and how effective you study. So I would say don't worry, because you can't control certain things. The only thing you can control is how well you define and how thoroughly you apply it back to the scenario of the question. But that is a fantastic question. Since I can't answer it, since you can't answer it, you know what? That's something that it's not worth thinking about. Okay. I mean, I don't say not worth thinking about it. I think that you want to focus on what you can control. Okay. Now we're looking at Jonah. Jonah wanted to ask, what are the top 5 psychologists? Well, I don't know. And it's kind of funny if you study 100 psychologists, but on the FRQ, they ask 1 or 2 that you didn't study. I would think that your time might be better spent studying concepts rather than people. Now, there are certain people that are critically important, but what you're asking is kind of like, what are the most important vocabulary words to study? We can't pick that out. And if you know anything about the stock market, it's like you can't time the stock market. You can't try to game the idea or kind of figure out what they're going to ask. Just give it an honest, even effort. Study as many things as you can. Yes, you want to associate Bobo Doll or self-efficacy with Albert Bandura, but I don't know that you want to purposely study people's names for the sake of studying their names. Okay. And then the next one we have Sabrina. I appreciate Sabrina's email, particularly because she included a pic of her dog, Bonnie. Sabrina wants to know what ways can she study or how can she prepare using psychology to maybe offset test anxiety. We all get a little bit nervous, and I would imagine I feel bad for students who are going to, hit open and they type in their ticket number and they're ready to go. What is the onrush of adrenaline? Okay, I would break your tasks up. Okay, and I think that practice is going to help a lot of us. If you haven't been practicing the FRQs up till now, that's okay. We still have about 3 weeks, but I really want you not just do the FRQ to learn the content. Start practicing under test taking methods. Set up a mock exam in your house, do an FRQ, time yourself. When you're done, hit save, and then send it to yourself via email. How long did it take? Okay. There's going to be nerves, but you guys are going to do fine. Again, practice is going to help you out. Hope this all makes sense, guys. You're doing fine. Keep the emails coming. Okay. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll join us again. Be sure to complete the practice question. We'll review the answer in the next lesson.